is Mr. Steve Igo. He at one time was a perfusionist. He's now retired from that profession, but he's the director of Entrepreneurial Institute and Cardio Design Laboratory at Houston Methodist. He's also one of the co-directors of the Pumps and Pipes conference, which I recommend you look at online and go to if you get an opportunity, whether live or on webinar. And he's going to be talking to us today about fully autonomous catheter navigation. Is this possible? Steve.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning. As Joe, and Roger, you can turn that volume down a little bit, I think. As Joe said, you know, there was a time when I was a perfusionist, and when I moved to Texas Heart Institute in the early 1970s, split in a different direction for me, and I ended up in the Cardiovascular Research Lab, which is now headed by Dr. Frazier. At that time, in the early 70s, is when we kind of began intra-aortic balloon pumping. There was a perfect storm because bedside hemodynamic monitoring was kind of introduced at the same time. We brought the two together, and the reason we did that is we wanted to develop circulatory support systems, implantable ventricular assist devices. That's not what I'm going to talk about this morning, but it's a little bit of history about me. Joe's given me an interesting topic this morning on fully autonomous catheter navigation. And make sure that. So by definition, I think what we're really talking about is three things. But perhaps most importantly is the software to make this work. Some call this data analytics, some people call it artificial intelligence, but all these things have to kind of come together to make an autonomous robotic catheter work. And the second thing is you need a roadmap, preferably a 3D roadmap, and you need a steerable, flexible robotic catheter. You may or may not need sensors. We'll talk about that a little bit. But this is kind of the definition of this moving forward. Now, a little bit of background. These guys are kind of interesting, these autonomous robots. And they do this a lot in Europe. They actually have soccer games that they play. So I'm going to play you a short video. These are not human-controlled. These are completely autonomous when they're doing it. As you watch this short little video, watch their heads, because their heads are trying to track this miniature soccer ball. I think that's remarkable. To watch these small robots, you can kind of get some idea of their size. They move around, they track the soccer ball, they know where the goal is, and they're actually able to do it. They move a little slow, but I think that over time, all of these things are going to improve, but these are self-contained robots. Now, let's go back a few years. Let's go back to the 1960s. This is a slide I found from the 1960s. These guys are riding around in their autonomously controlled cars, playing dominoes of all things. But this is kind of what people imagined in the 1960s. Well, we're still not quite there yet, but here's the concept car that Mercedes is working on. And we may see this in the 2020s. We're seeing more and more, for instance, cars now can park themselves. It's kind of scary to always watch. You know, you pull into a parking space and you just let your hands go off the wheel. Wheels turning this way, the wheels turning the other way. The car parks itself. This is done with sensors. That's what makes it happen. But also, there's a lot of software that goes into that to make that happen. Autonomous aircraft, drones primarily. They're flying these drones autonomously off of aircraft carriers now. Some of these drones can obviously stay up for very long periods of time. Self-flying planes.
With self-driving cars well on their way to becoming a reality, aerospace company Boeing is looking ahead to the next stage of autonomous vehicles: self-piloting planes. Planes can already take off, cruise and land using their onboard flight computers. The new technology, which Boeing hopes to test in a cockpit simulator this summer, would allow artificial intelligence to make some of the decisions normally made by pilots. If all goes well, Sinnott says the technology could be tested on a real aircraft sometime next year.
Well, I'm not sure I want to be on that flight, but it gives you some idea, and you've probably all heard about some of these developments. And the technology is moving forward very rapidly, especially in the areas of artificial intelligence. As we go forward with this, I may I have a talk a little later on today, kind of related back to the pumps and pipes aspect of it, but that's where we actually we're working with a company from Norway using their artificial intelligence software, and we're trying to integrate that into our patients in the ICUs, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But back to catheter robots for now. Conventional vascular catheterization. Essentially, most institutions, Dr. Lumsden showed you our hybrid suite, which is a fairly sophisticated system. But most cath labs work with 2D fluoroscopic imaging. It can be done in multiple planes. Sometimes you have to spin the C-arm around the patient, multiple views. That takes time. It increases radiation exposure to the operators, the interventionalists. Use radiopaque markers on the catheter to find out where they are, the placement. Are they in the right location, the right spot? We give contrast agents to visualize the vessels. Are you in the right spot, once again? And of course, radiation exposure. I'm going to talk about that a couple of times today. But that's important considerations. And so you might consider this the problem that autonomous catheters are trying to solve. So, what are the potential applications? I'm going to talk about three, but there are, at least on my short list that I have up here today, I had five. And Dr. Lumsden, we'll start from the bottom and work our way to the top. Dr. Lumsden talked about possibly the use of not only remote proctoring, but also perhaps you could remotely control a robot for emboli targeting in stroke patients. Second one from the bottom, electrophysiology. The EP guys have been using robotic catheters for intracardiac ablation for a number of years. In fact, our EP director at Houston Methodist trained people on how to use the Hansen robotic catheter for EP applications. Coronary circulation, lesion targeting. Pulmonary circulation, once again, pulmonary embolus, you're going after the clot. And then, of course, the systemic circulation. We're going to talk about complex endovascular procedures. Perhaps these can also be used for transcatheter valve replacement or repair procedures as well. So, this is relatively new stuff. This article was published in the Journal of Medical Robotics in 2016. And what they're talking about, and as you can see here, this is multiple institutions, multiple investigators. And what they were trying to do is identify the building blocks for an autonomous catheter navigation system. Essentially, at the end of the day, what we'd really like to do is put a bullseye on the target and have the catheter or the guide wire. If you can get the guide wire there first, you can put the catheter in over the guide wire. But these are kind of the elements, the building blocks of what it might take to develop this technology. So let's talk about this complex endovascular procedure using a flexible robotic catheter. And you're going to see, this is obviously an animation. I don't like to call them cartoons, but what you're going to see is the use of a flexible robotic catheter to place stent grafts in this fenestrated aortic graft. Now, in this case, this is not an autonomous catheter, what they're illustrating here. This is a person down in using the control system here. They're going to control where these catheters go. Sometimes you're not in the right spot. You got to evaluate, hit that target, the renal artery, steer around, and that's why contrast agent, you're doing a lot of fluoro time sometimes to do this. All of these things kind of add up. Now, the question is, can we move this kind of a procedure to a completely autonomous catheter to complete these kind of complex endovascular procedures? Shorten the time, shorten the fluoro time, and reduce the radiation exposure. That's kind of the primary goals at the end of the day. So we've been doing this at Houston Methodist. This is a project that's been headed by Dr. John Bismuth and Dr. Lumsden on using a flexible robotic catheter. And what we were interested in here is kind of one aspect possibly of this, of using electromagnetic tracking to find out where these catheters are going and steering them to the right spot. The objectives. Once again, we're using the Hansen robotic catheter. We're trying to decrease radiation exposure and shorten the time that it takes to actually do the procedure. In this case, we used an electromagnetic tracking system, which is attached to the fluoro table. And so using a flexible robotic catheter with the electromagnetic tracking, you can potentially, the hypothesis is less radiation, higher navigation quality and efficiency. This is kind of the system what it kind of looks like. Let's walk you around these slides. We had a 3D phantom of an aortic aneurysm, and you can see the robotic catheter in place. It's a complex twisting and turning. There were two things that we were looking at. We were trying to cannulate the renal arteries, and then down here we had another side port that was on the posterior side. It was very difficult to cannulate manually. Over here in the monitor, you can see a 3D reconstruction that was done with the Siemens Zigo system. You have the window field generator for tracking the magnets, the sensors. There were two sensors on the robotic catheter. A little bit more of a close-up of what you're looking at. Sorry. So this is the 2D image, and this is the 3D model. This is the posterior gate target that I was talking about. Very difficult to make these serpentine turns and hit that target in a 3D environment. So study design, we had 6 users that looked at this. We had the 2 targets we talked about, the renals and the posterior gate. We looked at 4 visualization methods. We had a number of endpoints that we were tracking, primarily fluoroscopy time, cannulation time, radiation levels. These are the 4 modes. Number 1 is control, which is just basically standard 2D fluoroscopy. You're trying to hit the target. Mode 2, 2D fluoroscopy, in which we overlaid the virtual catheter, looking at orientation and tracking. The third was the 3D volume here, and an endoluminal view. This is computer generated of what it looks like inside the vessel. You're trying to cannulate this spot right here, and here's the tip of the catheter. You're trying to move this catheter around to hit that target. And then lastly, mode 4, 3D volumes with both the anterior and the AP and the lateral view for tracking. This kind of shows you that for the 4 modes, how many times the twists and turns that it takes for someone to manually get into that gate. As you move forward, there's less and less manipulation and movement around to hit the target, so you're doing it quicker, less radiation time. The results from this study, there was really no difference between the three modes here with control for cannulating the renal artery. It was pretty easy to attack, but there was a big difference in time to hit that posterior gate. So, especially for the mode 4, goes from 274 seconds down to 2 seconds to hit that target. So, conclusion from this, that you can combine a flexible robotic catheter with electromagnetic tracking and end up with a safer, more efficient endovascular navigation of your catheter. So let's talk about the pulmonary circulation for a second. We use these ex vivo models. This is a heart-lung block connected to a ventilator and a pulsatile pump. Another view. And this is kind of the 3D reconstruction that you're able to get. In this case, we simulated a pulmonary embolus in one of the side branches of the pulmonary artery. This is what the view looks like from the 3D reconstruction. Once again, you're able to look at the lung, pulmonary circulation in 3D, and hopefully what you could do in the future is identify this site and put a target on it, and the catheter would go to that site. We use this model, let me go back, a little heavy on the button there. We use this model to train for devices that are used to aspirate clot from the lung. That was one of the other reasons why we developed this particular model. We've also developed a 3D printed model of the pulmonary artery. This happens to be from a CT image of a patient. And you can see what it looks like with a standard 2D fluoro view. Somewhat difficult to evaluate where the catheter is exactly with a 2D view once again. But here, we did use these views, and on the right you can see the Hansen catheter being advanced out far distally in the pulmonary bed. Now I'll also say, I'll just take a second, we also developed this particular model, this 3D printed model of the human lung, because we were also developing a bifurcated pulmonary artery cannula for right heart assist. And so we were using this model to test that as well. Dr. Lumsden mentioned the Corindus vascular robot system, and Corindus is working on an autonomous design. The advantages of the Corindus system is it is remote from the patient. This is the operator is protected from, shall we say, the radiation cloud. He's out of there. You can see the operator doesn't have to wear lead, and it's robotically controlled. When Dr. Lumsden and I were kind of talking about this company yesterday, they really are focused on software. We talked about that from the very beginning. This is kind of software-based company trying to solve the problem. And they were kind enough to provide me with an animation. Roger, can you click on that? That should play. Can you do that? Well, wouldn't you know it? Sorry about that, guys. What it would show, if it played, is they are tracking, they have a guide wire in place in this model, and they were going to, through software generation, track exactly the path of the guide wire as the guide wire was being advanced. In other words, the computer-generated animation, or the computer-generated image was overlaid on top of the the standard guide wire as it was being advanced. This is an area that is kind of interesting because it requires no sensors. And what they're trying to do is use standard X-ray equipment, shall we say, in the operating room, rather than these more sophisticated 3D systems. So, in conclusion, I think that what you're really looking for is a rapid, low-cost, off-the-shelf kind of application. You don't want to have to build hybrid suites to be able to use fully autonomous catheter navigation. You want to integrate them into kind of the cath lab environment that exists using these standard imaging hardware. You want to reduce radiation exposure as much as possible. This is going to require software, data analytics, and artificial intelligence, as I mentioned. You need a 3D roadmap, which may require some virtual reality on top of that, and then a robotic guide wire or a robotic catheter. So I think that fully autonomous catheter navigation is on the horizon, and I think that we're going to see it sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.